All right, looks like we're live. So, we're back with another little stream about one of my mixing projects. As I said in the description, this one's about a band called SandCat. I think a relatively new, unknown band. And I figure it's kind of an interesting little project and mix to look at because it's a little bit out of the ordinary. It has synths or keys, drums and saxophone. And that's it, just a trio lineup. Yeah, so I guess it makes sense to just first play the song because this is not out yet, so no one will actually know this song. So here we go. All right, short little song, but some really cool stuff going on, I think, in terms of sounds and in terms of composition, and some cool lead playing as well by both their players on keys as well as the saxophonist. So let's maybe, instead of starting with drums as I did in the previous ones, maybe let's start with some synth sounds, because that's kind of the core, I guess, of what this mix and their music is all about. So I guess the main thing is this really bright kind of vintagey sounding synth here. Which keeps going throughout the entire song, as you probably noticed. So let's see how I treated this. I think all in all, by the way, this mix is quite vanilla. That's to say, it doesn't have a lot of like processing really on it. It's quite minimal. But the processing that is on it is often a little bit exaggerated, as I'll show you. So for example, if I disable these little plugins and I also disable the effects here that it's being sent to, then we hear how it sounds just plain on its own. It's a great sound, I think. But what did I do here? Well, first of all, nothing super exciting, but I just cut off some of the low end. And that's basically to, first of all, I just thought it sounded a little bit muddy for the purpose it has in the song, which is mostly this bright kind of wide pad that kind of plays the harmony of the song. So with that, and also of course to create some space for the bass later on, because as you might have heard in the beginning, the bass is like this super big synthy stereo, gnarly synth sound. So that needs some space to sit. Anyway, so with this cut off in place. So it's subtle, but just cleans it up a little bit. So here we go to my usual virtual mix rack. Let's see what we did here. First of all, this is just their console emulation, which I use most of the time just in basic stock settings. Don't do much of it. Although it is hitting pretty hard. Okay, so then for the main thing that this one here that really affects the sound, it does this. Oh, actually, that doesn't do that much. Maybe later on. No. I even have it turned off, so dumb as I am. I mean, that does happen sometimes, right? You pull in some effects that you thought you were going to use. You might have turned them all the way down and just left it there. So it's not doing anything anyways. Or actually, it does do something if it's all the way to 0. So, you know, it does give some flavor of whatever this module does. It's I think I talked about this little module in one of my past streams, where it's part of these 3 like tube saturating type of effects. So even if you have it at 0, it just brings a little bit of color, a little bit of saturation and sheen to the sound, but it's very subtle now. So then what do we have here? Well, we have a boost at 4.46K. So this Neve style EQ here, it's very obvious. Anything you do in here is very exaggerated. So I like this EQ often when I want the EQ move to kind of stand out and be kind of in your face and obvious. I use it on a lot of electric guitars if I want to give it a little bit more bite or presence or note definition, you know, that kind of thing. So I used it for that purpose here as well, just to pump up the brightness a little bit in a good way. Just makes the synth poke out a little bit better, especially when it's combined with the other instruments. And then what do we have here? Another EQ. Well, this one seems to be all, well, this is all set to do nothing except this one at 10K, which is adding some top end. So that one does off and on. So all in all, I would say I didn't do much to that, just because it sounds great as is. What I did do, though, effect-wise, is I sent it to this delay bus here and to a reverb. So, I guess I cut off some more low end here to feed the... Does that make sense? Oh, wait, I'm on the wrong track here. Well, synth delay, this one. Zoop. So, first of all, an Echo Boy, which I featured before, my favorite delay plugin. So as you might have heard, it sounds very wobbly and floaty, and that's because the pitch is being modulated, and it's on this Memory Man preset that I probably tweaked a little bit. It's set to a very short 1/8 note delay. And then after that, I seem to have put some EQ, and for some reason I only EQ'd the sides, because you can, with this really nice Fab filter EQ, you can set whether you're applying the effect on the stereo buzz or buzz on stereo, or only in the mids or the sides. So I had it set to side. Not sure why. Let me see. Yeah, I guess I understand. It's like you do have these low cut and high cut dials in the plugin here, in the delay plugin, which I could have used, and I think I probably went for that first. But if you roll this up, which does essentially the same as doing this move there, well, that made it too thin, I guess, for my taste. So what I did is I only rolled off the low end on the sides, so that the low end still remains in the mids. Sounds a little fuller. Anyway, nice little wobbly effect to complement the very bright and kind of static sounding synth. So together, without the reverb though. If I put it up to exaggerate the effect. You know, in the mix it's kind of subtle, but you do feel this kind of floaty, very stereo effect, which I really like. And then there's some reverb as well, and I use this awesome Valhalla shimmer. Not sure if I featured that one before in one of my streams, but it's an awesome sounding reverb. You know, it tends to create that very shimmery, long, high, crystally type of reverb. However, I put down the high cut quite a bit, made a little bit smaller the size, and yeah, this is what it does if we listen to it in solo, only the effect. And with the effects in place. So again, nothing spectacular there, but just what it needs, hopefully. Let's leave this one for a little bit later. This one as well. Some saxophone. Let's look at the saxophone. So let's first of all turn off this reverb it's being sent to. And yeah, let's just see how it sounds completely dry. That is not dry. I must have sent it to another reverb, obviously. So let's see where I send it. To synth. I also shared it with the reverb I was just talking about. So let's mute that as well. Awesome, I love saxophone, especially that clappery tuck 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 sound in the background. It sounds so nice. So again, just some roll off of the low end to clean things up. It doesn't really do much to the sound. So what do we have here? Again, this unit here. Let's turn these off and go through them one by one real quickly. This little compressor is really nice if you, well, I love it at least to control things a little bit dynamically, but not use it too aggressively. And I'm guessing I didn't hit it too hard. That's mostly where I dial this one in, depending, of course, on what the purpose is on the track. But in this case, just that on the louder moments, it maybe hits 3 dB, cuts 3 dB off. So that is just to control that it doesn't poke out too much out of the mix when he plays a little bit harder. Again, nothing really groundbreaking there. Then this module we just looked at in when looking at the synth. So if I push this much harder, so you can actually hear what it does. Well, then it gets really ugly, which can be cool sometimes for effect. But on this source, I dialed it in just before it really starts being noticeably ugly, if that makes sense. So kind of getting the maximum out of it in a transparent way. And it just brings out the harmonics a little bit better, a little bit more of the air in the saxophone. A little bit more presence, that type of thing. So if I A-B again with and without. That was with and without. Here it sounds a little bit empty if you turn it off. So I love these things. So again, the Neve style EQ. What do we do here? It doesn't seem like I did anything here. So again, one of these instances where I left something that I could have just deleted. And I guess that makes sense. Maybe I wanted to try and add some extra presence to it, which is often very nice to saxophones. But in this case, the saxophone in the song has kind of a background role, doubling the piano part. So it doesn't need to cut through that harshly. So that's probably why I removed that one. I did, however, add this more subtle sounding, transparent sounding EQ, added some top end and a little bit of that presence 4K area. That was with the EQ and without. So again, all pretty subtle, just because the source sounds good, so don't overdo it, right? Then, so yeah, I remember now, I first created this reverb here, and this is another lovely reverb by the guys from Valhalla. Yeah, what's to say? This one is just a little bit more traditional sounding instead of that shimmer delay reverb. So it sounds like this. And the decay time is not too long, and I think I figured once I put this on, well, it sounds good. It makes it sound just how you kind of want to hear a saxophone, but it's not like ambient enough to sit with the rest of the song. So then he decided to also send it to this shimmer reverb here, and then it sounds like this. So you have two reverbs. You almost need to pause it to really take in what it does, right? You hear this breath at the end when I stop. Very nice sounding. So as you can see, by the way, this session is really compact. There's not a lot of tracks. Like, I don't often get projects that are this that have this few tracks, little tracks, few tracks. And that includes the drums. They were recorded in a very simple fashion, I guess, and they didn't bother recording and putting in any room mics. Maybe they didn't have the proper studio to do that, or maybe they didn't have enough tracks. I don't know. I didn't ask. We can take a quick look at that though, like how I kind of added some fake ambience to the sound to mimic, some roominess, because that's kind of the thing with this type of music. You do want some roominess, right? Otherwise, if you have really dry sounding drums, that would feel really weird in this context. So just to solo the drums here, maybe this part. Instead of looking at all those close mics like we did before, maybe let's go to that little to the room track. When I do this, it depends on how I would approach it. In this case, I think, let me just double check. Okay, yeah, so let's go back a step and first just quickly look at something I showed you before, I think in the Our Oceans one, is that this is the kick mic as they recorded it. Sounds like this. Then there's a trigger, a sample being triggered in this slate trigger module. That's just for the normal purpose of adding some additional, to make the sound a little bit more complete, so to speak. And then secondly, I added another trigger sample, which is of a room. Again, same plugin. And that one sounds like this. So there you have already some roominess, and I put them a little louder maybe than I would usually put them if a band would give me recordings with actual room mics recorded. So you already have some room here. Same goes for the snare. The snare has, again, also close mic sample and a room sample. Just to show how it sounds without and with. It's also with some gating on there. That's why it sounds so dead. And that's with the rooms on there. It just gives a sense of length and breadth and air, And I did the same to the toms, actually, something I don't often do, but when you're lacking those room mics, and you really need them in this case, you do whatever's needed, right? So the toms, just to fill here. So those are the room mic samples of the toms. So why did I show that? Because all of these things are being sent to this room sim track bus. As you can see here, this is how that works in Reaper. You can see here the receives of other tracks. So the kick trigger room, the kick snare trigger room, and the toms. And then I also send the overheads there. Oftentimes it will only send the overheads there if I need to do this type of thing. But it's just some trial and error and see what works for the mix. So in this case I send the overheads and I put them in a little bit quieter. So without any effect, you just have this sound. That obviously already sounds kind of roomy because it's room samples being sent there. But then I went ahead and put on these plugins, and this one is the important one here. So for those of you who are not aware with Altiverb, it's one of those convolution-based reverbs, meaning that they have like acoustic blueprints, if you will, of ambient spaces, and they have a whole collection of spaces they captured here, a whole bunch of studios and other types of situations. So I searched for something that was not too bright and long because I didn't want to overdo it. And besides, like I just said, there's already some roominess going on in the samples themselves. So this is just to kind of give it even more of a room flavor, but not too long of a room. And I remember I also chose this kind of stone looking thing because it sounded kind of bright, and that's what I liked. So that sounds like this. Without. So immediately you get this very realistic sounding room sound. Almost as if they put up room mics. So that's really nice. And then, oops. Added some EQ. What I will often do is roll off a lot of the top end of room mics because otherwise the cymbals start bleeding through too much, especially if you put on some compression later on. It tends to like really bring out the cymbals, which can be annoying. Anyway, that sounds like this. And that gives me some fake room mics to add to the drums. If we turn them off, even though we will still hear the room samples, maybe I can turn those off as well so you can hear how dry it would otherwise sound. Let's see, the snare, those and those. Still okay, but just very dry. So let's unmute these things once again. It's subtle, but it's noticeable. Okay, so maybe let's take a look at that awesome sounding bass patch. I have no idea what type of synths or plugins they used, but this one does sound very gnarly and cool, I think. Let's listen to it again in the full song so you can get a picture for that. So in solo, so cool, that little drop there. Oh, okay, let's take a look here. This one needed some more polishing to sit well. So first of all, I did some similar stuff as I showed you earlier. I think I did it to the delay, right? Where I used an EQ again from FabFilter, but again in MS mode, if you will, to first of all a low cut on the mids, and this one is more general cleanup thing. It's set so low, you know, as you can see, only to 35 Hertz, so it barely does anything, just removes some excessive rumble if it's there. But this one is more important. So I rolled off the lows in the sides much up to a much higher point, because if I remove that and just play it as is, then I don't know if you can hear that, but the lows are also spread out very wide in the stereo spectrum, and that can be annoying in a full mix. So this just makes it sound a little bit more focused, and it's one of these things that you don't really consciously hear very much, but it does clean things up. So then I noticed, even though that top end sizzliness of this bass sound sounds cool, there's some crispiness in there that I don't like. That sounds kind of digital to me, for lack of a better word. I'll play it to you again so you can listen and see if you hear what I mean. This kind of crackling sound in the very top end. That's actually also why I already cut off some top end here, because if I remove it, it just gets ugly. It's nice that it's so bright, but not so much. So a little bit rolled off here. It's already better. But then I decided to add this Soothe plugin. I'm not sure if I showed this one before, but this one is very nice to put on anything that's harsh sounding in any way, or that has like frequencies, little spikes of frequencies that kind of jump out of the sound source and that are too complex or that are moving around so that you cannot really control with a traditional EQ. So this one is kind of like an active multi-band dynamic EQ, if you will. You can see what it does if I press play. Even though it's doing something very subtle right now as to how it's set. It's set that it's very that it basically is more sensitive to this area here, to the upper to the top end, which I found annoying. And then this one is like how much it kind of polishes the sound. Like if I turn it up, you see that it filters out all of these frequencies in real time. You hear how it softens up the sound? It's easy to overdo, but it's nice if it's used well. And then, again, back to the mix rack. Talked about that one before. Let me turn these off. So, decided to add some kind of high presence around 6K and around 1.6. So that one without and with. It's again subtle moves. So you get a sense of what we're doing there. So when I tried to find like whatever to bring out in these things, I might often like exaggerate these moves a little bit, not too much, because then it gets confusing. But you know, just turn it up a couple of dBs and then you can kind of search for the frequencies that you like, you know. So then, yeah, this one, previously when I was showing the other synth, I thought I put something quite drastic on there, but it was this one actually. So this one, same module as I put on this on the synth, but here with the saturation all maxed out, and it kind of gives this overly saturated, like contained sound or something. I like it. Yeah, I think I was saying previously, right, that there's a time and a place to max these things out, and this is one of them. If I lower it and make it more subtle. Yeah, I love that. maxed out. It's just starting to create its own harmonics because of the saturation, but because the sound source is so bright in itself, the harmonics it creates and adds with it kind of blend in and make it sound as one big sound. You know, you don't really consciously hear any saturation being added in that sense. It just makes the sound bigger and fatter, I think. Some more EQ, which is not too interesting. And then I don't use this plugin a lot, this module, because, well, I just don't. Usually when I do use it, it's to add air. But in this case, I was still not satisfied with that crispy top end. So I decided to try a bunch of things to soften it up even more. And I settled on this one. And again, it's probably quite subtle. Okay. Okay, I'll let it play a little bit longer here, a little bit further, so you know which section we're listening to, so we can take a quick look at these cool solos right here. So what you're listening to there, I think I didn't ask for any explanations. I just saw what the tracks were called. So this one is called, I think they pronounce this Iwi in the scene, or Uwi or something. Iwi, I think Iwi. And it's one of these, if I'm not mistaken, one of these like, you know, saxophone synthesizers, if that makes sense. So it's a synthesizer controller, a MIDI controller. But being played as a saxophone. And also if you listen to the note choice, it sounds like a saxophone player is playing here. So that's this this track right here. That sounds awesome to me. Nice and gimmicky, but in a good way. It's actually nice that you hear some stuttering sounds, as if the controller is not perfectly controlling the synth sound. Anyway, so that's that sound, and so fortunately, their keys player is kind of has a good, well, what's the word? A lot of times when I hear keyboard players or synthesizer players, whatever they want to call themselves, play solos, they tend to sound very static to me, and that's because that instrument in itself can sound very static. But this is already a kind of nice, moving, if you will, sounding patch. I think he's also controlling it probably with maybe his expression wheels or something. Still though, it needed some touching up, if you will, some polishing. So without any effects, it sounded like this. So I did not put on any time-based effects, no reverbs or delays, because it's in there already and I didn't feel it needed any extra. So first of all, some pretty drastic cleaning up of the low end and top end. That's often needed, I find, with synths. They often have like very low rumbling stuff going on, or top end that's just going on, you know, too much in the high end, for my taste at least. So by taming that, it just sounds a little bit more like an acoustic instrument to me. Then, what else do we have? Again, nothing out of the ordinary here. We talked about this EQ, talked about that one. The moves are a little bit bigger, especially on this EQ. As I said before, it's quite drastic or in your face. So this, it definitely needed a lot of extra presence to cut through the mix here. Like if I would put it in context of the rest and without any of these EQs. Then it gets completely lost. And then probably most prominently for the sound is this, again, this Devil plugin, one of my favorite distortion plugins. So let me just go through what this does and how I dial this in a lot of times. Often this sounds really cool if it's just blended in a little bit. So I often have this dial set only to 1 or 2 maybe. But to dial it in, I would just first max it out and see how it sounds all wet. Well, you hear that I have the darkness engaged. So if I turn that down, turn also that down, you can hear how it sounds without just at stock settings. It's already pushing, as you will hear. So that's it, like that. But what I wanted was a lot of crunch, which is just their name for distortion, I guess. So if you turn that up, then it gets incredibly gnarly, which can be really nice if you just tame the top end. So hence this darkness dial. Often try to find this happy medium where you still hear the rattling kind of side effects of the distortion itself, but that it's just not incredibly ear-piercingly annoying. And then just go back to this mix dial and just blend it in ever so subtly so that it sounds the way you like it. Hear how thin it sounds if you first hear it like this. And because this sound is just so overly saturated in your face, you only need like a tiny little bit. And, you know, even on one, it's very obvious what it does, I think. So yeah, and especially if you do these type of effects post time-based effects, and like I just said, like reverb and delay were already in here, or at least definitely delay, then these delay repeats or the reverb as well will get this treatment as well. And that sounds especially nice to me, that you get that shoegazy effect if you do it on guitar, for example, where it gets just a little bit more dirty because all the delay repeats get dirtied up by the saturation effects. So that is cool. Then here, when it ends, it kind of makes room for this EWI thing. nice little slight pitch bend there. Yeah, so now I'm looking at this Iwi thing. Let's take off what we did here. So I remember when I first heard this, I thought like, well, sounds cool, but it gets really annoying in this region that you kind of see that I selected in this EQ. So if I turn that one off. As you can hear, it's getting annoying when he's playing higher notes, not so much the lower ones. I think you can, yeah, here you can hear it well. So again, in the beginning of the phrase, you can hear it well. But I didn't want to EQ it all out because, as I said, when he's playing in, for example, the lower register, it's still nice to have those frequencies in there. So then that's a good case for using this dynamic EQ thing here, which works very nicely in this Fab Filter EQ. So instead of like, it's basically set to 0, but it has a potential basically of minus 3.59. And it just listens back to whatever frequencies occur in that range that I selected. And if they cross the threshold, the EQ will start to work, and you can see it visually. Works really well to tame annoying frequencies like that. In here, well, all of these three here are kind of basic stuff, so I won't talk about that too much. Definitely a bump in the 600s, which is where kind of that saxophone-y body and note definition lives for this type of thing. I thought that was too empty sounding, and even around 360. So, you know, and it's, again, this is quite a big boost in this EQ. So a lot of added body. Probably if I play it in context, you will hear that it, especially this first run, that it needs some more of that. Turn these off. You almost actually don't hear it right now. Although it's supposed to be a background layer here still, because the other solo is still playing. Hence it's a little bit lower in volume there. But let's do this in solo and without, so. Especially the added EQ here just gives it some nice rumbly when he plays those lower notes. And then I guess I did a similar thing again on this. This is one of the other tube saturation, excuse me, modules. This one's sounding a little bit darker than the ones that I had previously selected, and this Hollywood one, but it does a similar job. And again, I use this pretty heavily, and probably exactly for the same purposes as I was talking with the other synth, because even though this is one of those EV things, it's still a synth. Such an interesting sound. And I personally would have preferred to put this up a little bit in volume, and I remember I did in my first mix, but that was some of the feedback that I got, that they wanted this to sit a little bit more in the background of the big outro climax of the song, which is understandable as well. And that leads me maybe to one of the, maybe we can talk about that lastly here, is how chaotic and big and kind of overly saturated in its entirety this ending sounds. And that was something that I initially thought would sound cool when I was mixing this. I didn't get any instructions from the people who from the musicians, so I just did my own thing, and I was actually scared that I maybe overdid it, and I said so when I sent off the first version of the mix, and the feedback was that it could be even more pronounced and chaotic, so so that's what I did. So let's look at some of the elements that do this. Well, on the drums, I did something I wouldn't normally do in many cases because it's quite drastic, but I put on this cassette thing besides the normal treatment. So this is kind of an effects for the purpose of the song effect. So we might have talked about this plugin earlier, but basically simulates, well, it's pretty obvious what it simulates. And you can set all types of parameters. You can go in the deep settings here. Anyway, what I used it for here is to kind of give the drums some, yeah, it's just some tape saturation basically, and a little bit too much. So if you listen to the drums in solo and you, yeah, pay attention to the kick, you will hear it most clearly. It's almost like this little sounding thing. And what I did for the song is that I automated this input control of the plugin, which is this dial right here. And that basically controls how much saturation is on there. So in the beginning of the song, it's relatively clean. And at the ending, it's one of these things where I search for like that fine line of it being too ugly and just giving the right vibe to the song. But it does give this sense of like push, and just, you know, also because these drums were being played quite not so dynamically in the song, whereas the song itself is one big climax build. So I wanted to have some trick up my sleeve to kind of exaggerate the dynamics, if you will, at the end. So that's one thing I did for the ending climax. Then what else did we do? Well, this synth that we talked about earlier just keeps on playing and playing and playing, and it naturally gets louder, as you can even see in the waveform. That was just how it's being played, I think. Really nice voicings. And then I think he doubled it an octave lower or something. Oh yeah, and there he doubles also the piano part that's added, lowers another layer. So that already sounds like very full, also because these sounds, including the bass that we talked about earlier, all of these sound sources are incredibly rich in their spectral content, if you will, you know, the frequency spectrum it covers. So it's already sounding big with only these two elements soloed, right? But then they wanted more chaos. So, well, of course, these lead sounds help. Then there's this little piano track. Very nice. This is an interesting little trick maybe to talk about briefly. If I disable this EQ, you see it right here, and I play this part in context of the song. and try to pay attention to the piano. You can hear it, but it just sounds so dull. And again, that's because it is competing with all those very rich sounding synths. But you cannot EQ a piano too drastically, or it won't sound like a piano anymore. It sounds very unnatural, and piano is one of these instruments that you really want to have sound natural, I think. So a good trick for that is one of these tilt type EQs. And what that does, you set kind of like a middle frequency of where it tilts. And then you have some, depending on the EQ, you have some different types of tilts. This is a flat tilt, meaning this, you see this whole thing, like if I move this gain knob around, you just see the whole spectrum like kind of fall in one direction. So if you hear it solo, just without this, sounds cool, but we needed something again to compete with those in the higher frequencies. So if I play it and I just dial up this control, and activate the EQ would be helpful, otherwise you cannot hear anything. So the cool thing is that you can actually go quite far with it, and you can use it quite exaggerated without it sounding unnatural. There's a point, of course, where it's going to sound weird, but I think I had it something at like something in this range set before, and that does make all the difference in how it sits within the rest of the track. Could even push it louder, but you know, it's not supposed to take it's not supposed to be a priority instrument, so I thought it set well in at that setting. Nothing here, so very little treatment there. Yeah, I think that about covers it here. Again, it's quite a simple mix, not a lot of tracks, which can, you know, it has its challenges and its advantages. It's easier to get the balance right, but it's harder to get it to sound big. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at this, and kind of forgot to take a look at the chat, but the chat is not very busy anyway, so I'm sure that's fine. But greetings back to Bjornar? Bjornar. Nice name. Sounds very Scandinavian, I think. So greetings back, and thank you, or well, I think thank you from the band, that they have lots of nice textures going on. And Mr. Silence, or Mrs. Silence, says, beautiful atmosphere, so moody. The mix is amazing. Well, thank you. And again, thank you from the band. I'm sure I'm allowed to say that for them, because indeed it's a short, very atmospheric little track. And it's one of these things where when I was mixing, where I was kind of wishing it was longer, but kind of, I think, in a good way, because it leaves you wanting more if when it ends. So, all cool. So, thank you for those who have been watching today. I already posted this on Facebook, but for those of you who haven't seen that, I'm gonna do a podcast type of thing on this same channel. And next week, I'll have my first guest on, which is the amazing guitar player Jason Goebel from Cynic. So I'm very much looking forward to that, and I invite you all to be there and to ask some questions in the chat. And I hope it'll be a little bit busier than it is today. Okay, Mr. Pat says, really inspiring and helpful. Okay, thank you, and I'm very glad you got something out of this. Cool, so I'll say goodbye with that, and hope to see you next time. So, peace.